Hello and welcome to the Education Magazine, our 6th edition, and we've got quite something in store today because we are going to be talking about the hot topic of fabricated illness, and we have a range of experts here with us today to talk about that condition and that situation. And we also have a parent, Ellie, who will be talking about her own personal experiences of what happened to her when she was involved in an episode of allegations of that kind. We do not see that behaviour in school, yet you see the behaviour at home. I've known that to be said so many times as an educational practitioner. A parent saying, well, look, I'm having terrible problems at home with my child, and he or she's having meltdowns, and yet the school say, we don't see it. And that is a common problem which exists in education, the comparison between behaviours exhibited within one context and not seen in another. And that is the kind of sequence of events that lead to accusations that commonly, I guess, you would know it as a condition dating back to when we used to call it Munchausen's syndrome and Munchausen's syndrome by proxy. It's now better known as fabricated or induced illness and perplexing presentations. And those are the terms really used by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And they've recently published some guidance on this. And the guidance says that where a child is reported to have symptoms or disabilities that impact significantly on their everyday functioning, and yet thorough medical evaluation has not revealed adequate or realistic medical explanation. There's around 12.5 million children under the age of 16 in the UK, and it's said that this is a kind of thing that happens to around 350 cases in the UK each year. Is that correct? Is that really understating the statistics? Is it a lot more? And in my experience, I can tell you that in the years that I've been practicing in education law, I've seen it all too often. It's a very frequent allegation, and it often raises its head when parents are asking for home education for their children because they cannot cope with the everyday demands that a school presents. Families are obviously investigated, often erroneously, and today we're going to be looking at the traumas that many families face and the great levels of distress and even family breakdown that often occurs as a result, really, of a direct result of being viewed as a possible perpetrator of child abuse. And I think we should start by introducing a parent who has been through a terrible ordeal herself. Her son had bowel complications and went through 9 years without any diagnosis. And it turned out that the child had a complex range of disabilities, including what's more commonly known as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is an inherited condition that affects the connective tissues in the body. And yet it's not easily diagnosed, and it led to a real horror story for Ellie. Before I introduce you to Ellie, I just thought I'd introduce you to the panel of experts who are also with us. Not only have we got parent Ellie Costello, of course, who I just mentioned, but we have Cathleen Long, who is a specialist independent social work practitioner. I've worked with her many times over the years. She has an MA in autism, and she's very proud of that. And I think it's probably fair to say that she's also been diagnosed as having autism herself. Kathy, good day to you.
Thank you. Hello, Mike, and thank you for having me.
And if I may, I'd like to introduce you to Judy Eaton. She's a chartered clinical psychologist with a special interest in neurodevelopmental disorders in both children and adults. Judy, hello to you.
Hello. Thank you for having me as well.
And we also have with us Dr. Fiona Gullon-Scott, and Fiona is an academic and clinician specialising in autistic spectrum conditions with over 25 years experience in that area. So Fiona, very warm welcome to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
And last but not least, we have Professor Andy Bilson, Professor of Social Work at the University of Central Lancashire and a visiting researcher at the Cambridge Institute of Public Health at the University of Cambridge. I'm delighted to have you with us today, Andy. Good day to you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I mentioned a moment ago, didn't I, that I would introduce you to Ellie Costello, the mum who had went through a terrible ordeal. Ellie, please welcome to our production. Thank you for joining us, and please tell us a little about what happened in your case.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share our story. So I had a baby who presented with difficulties with his bowel at birth and was in lots and lots of pain, cried consistently for days, weeks, months, hours each day, slept for 20 minutes, would wake up and scream. I was told it was colic. I was told I was first-time parent, he'll grow out of it. What happened in real terms was that one day he just stopped crying like a switch. It was extraordinary. And we just put it down to weaning and all the rest of it. The years went on. I knew as soon as this crying stopped, the child that was left behind was very nervous, very clingy, struggled to separate. And that theme was evidenced really throughout preschool, transition to reception, transitioning between key stages, etc. What happened around the very start of year 4 was that he fell into a health crisis. So he was by this time 8. He was classed as failure to thrive. We'd had chronic ill health throughout his life up until that point. We always saw the same GP. And I kept on going back to the same GP because I was just so certain that she would see what I was reporting in terms of the physical ill health and the struggles with his capacity to engage in normal activities, struggles at school and bullying and all the rest of it. What happened though, actually, is at the point that he fell into health crisis and was placed as failure to thrive, and his mental health was declining so badly, we were struggling to attend school, was that I ended up going to see the GP several times in a fortnight because my son was laying awake at night shaking in pain. He was 8 and he was starting to hallucinate and have very specific neuralgic pain. All of his senses were going awry, really troubling behaviour. And my instincts were telling me that he's absolutely kept falling into a state of collapse. Somebody has to do something. And we went to see the GP and she conducted a thorough medical exam, which she had done on numerous occasions. The problem was that, on hindsight, that the root of that problem was actually sitting in his pelvis. So it wasn't being picked up on a medical exam. So, and actually the difficulties that we've been presenting with for the first 9 years, we potentially should have been referred to a specialist, but we never got there because the GP had the perception in her head that I was over anxious and I was making it up. And ultimately she said to me, you're making your son ill. This was in front of my son. You're making your son ill. I do not want to see you here again. You've got to get him into school. There's nothing wrong with him. She turned to my son. She said, don't listen to your mum. She's making it up. You've just got to get on with it. And we left that appointment and we were in such a state of distress. And I remember saying, is this going on our notes? What does this mean? And I said, we're here to help. There's something wrong. Please, he's ill. And she said, I've made a paediatric referral, that'll do. The paediatric referral took another 4 months to come through and another 2 months for the actual appointment to take place. So we were 6 months in acute need and pain. All the while, because of what the GP had said, we then hit a cycle where we had to get him into school. Health had said there was nothing there, and that fundamentally totally broke my son's trust and faith that adults could keep him safe. He stopped talking, he stopped leaving the house, the self-harm was horrendous, the nightmares were horrendous, my mental health completely declined. After we left that GP on that day, my son said to me, I don't think I was meant to be born, Mummy. And I said, what makes you say that, Finn? He said, I don't fit on this planet. Everybody else is okay and I don't fit. And what he meant years later was he was in constant pain, but because the pain had started pre-verbally, he'd lived with it chronically all his life from 7 days old when his bowel blocked up. And he thought, as he went to school and saw all his friends coping, that he was the only one who couldn't cope with the pain, and that actually it was normal for everyone to go through this. And so he internalized these messages. I'm the broken one, I'm the bad one, I'm the failure. We've got a developmental trauma and disrupted attachment profile, which is devastating as his birth mother, when I was doing everything I could. And I knew, my instincts told me there was more going on. As it happens, we ended up paying what little savings we had to get some private care, and we ended up ultimately with identifying a 7 centimetre calcified fecalith, which was part of the problem. But the cause of that was because he had a connective tissue disorder, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and we've now got numerous, his orthopedics is off. We've got mast cell activation, immunity, allergy difficulties.
And how long did that take? How long was it before, from the GP saying that to your getting ultimately a diagnosis?
It was another year. So we had 6 months in and out of hospital. I remember social care made a call after I was in 3 separate A&Es, because I was just kind of like my son was shaking in pain. He was just, and it was me going to 3 separate A&Es, and that safeguarding flag was raised, and the school nurse called, and I just broke down in tears, and I said, oh, thank God, because at that point school were just focusing on attendance. GP had closed her door, and it was the school nurse actually that ended up being one of the people to kind of go, okay, let's listen to this family's history. But then from that point, so it was 6 months in and out of hospital, and then it was another calendar year working within the early help and social care framework, trying to work on attendance and trying to find the right consultant, who then ultimately, so he first fell into crisis aged 8 3/4, but we didn't get the diagnosis until he was 10 1/4.
Did other people, not just the GP, did other experts in the NHS Trust accuse you, as did the GP?
No, I don't think, no, but it was all so complex, because we had early help in the process, we had school, we had family support, we had CAMS at one point. There were so many professionals, and they were all reading notes. But what was really scary was the narrative that went on around attendance, and mum is over anxious, and mum is doing this, and mum is making her son ill. And in hindsight, I mean, this journey broke me. It sent me into complete nervous breakdown. I know that's not an accepted term. I don't know what else to call it, but I absolutely lost my way for a year, and I had 2 relapses the following years as well, on the sort of time when it happened the first time. It was devastating. Marriage was under enormous strain, so I think what's really difficult about it is that the lens goes back to home. And you said something really interesting around school don't see it. That's exactly the conversation we had. He's fine when he's at school. Actually, looking back at his reports, he was a shadow. So people would say, we'd really want him to participate in class, but he's just melting into the wall. What we now know is that he was on survival mode his entire life. He was coping at school and melting down at home. And that's a trauma response. That's absolutely understandable. And he was just trying to put one foot in front of the other. In the end, he collapsed as well and completely broke down. And we lost him. Refusal to eat, sleep, wash, speak, everything. We lost him. And my relationship with him was really damaged. And we had to enter, and my husband's, we had to enter a therapeutic parenting framework with experts in trauma and attachment in order to learn the tools to reach him, to understand and calm the hugely dysregulated and distressed behaviours. The noises that came out of him when he was in distress were Yeah. Yeah.
No, I can understand. I mean, did he have ultimately an education healthcare plan? Did you get him a statement?
That took 4 years.
Really?
Took 4 years. Yeah.
Ellie,
And
please stay with us for the remainder of the presentation, because I want to bring in some experts to talk about the episode that you went through and the accusation, really, of fabricating an illness. I mean, it's extraordinary. Fiona, I read that in the cases of autism, roughly 1 in 5 mothers of children with autism have been investigated by social services, and I've seen it that reported that roughly 1 in 6 have had their children even removed into foster care or placed into adoption. Fiona, I'd like you to comment on that and perhaps also tell our audience what is fabricated illness or perplexing presentations, and explain it in the best way possible.
Okay, I think I'll start with that in terms of what is fabricated and induced illness and perplexing presentations. So you would think that with the name being fabricated and induced illness, it means illnesses that are made up or caused, created, induced in the child. And that is effectively what Munchausen syndrome by proxy was. It was a parent who made their child ill on purpose or lied and pretended that their child was ill in order to get a reaction. But actually, fabricated and induced illness, as it's defined by the Royal College of Child Paediatrics and Paediatrics Child Health, is actually much broader than that. And they admit that. So they've gone beyond that. And they say, actually, we can include parents who have no intention to deceive at all. We will include parents who are just worried about their child and behaving anxiously. It doesn't matter what the motivation of the parent is. They don't have to be inducing it. They don't have to be intentionally fabricating it. They might be erroneously reporting without even realizing. And all of that is included as FII and treated as if it's equally as abhorrent as actually inducing illness in a child. Perplexing presentations is something that's also been created by the RCPCH. And it is a term that it talks about situations where nobody's really quite sure what's going on. So it's complicated presentations, basically, that nobody's got to the bottom of. But it's presented by the RCPCH effectively as if, as medics, there is an answer, and if they can't find the answer, then whatever's left is non-existent. It's psychosomatic. It's been made up. So the assumption is you can explain it all, and if you can't explain it all and we don't find a cause, then everything else is being invented, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And that's effectively the premise of what's going on, and that's why this is such a huge problem, because it's lumping together firstly the assumption that the medics know everything. When you're talking about general practitioners and paediatricians who know a little about a lot because they're generalists, then they don't know everything. And it's lumping, so it's assuming that in the start, but it's also including parents who are just worried about their child and don't know what's going on and are asking lots of questions, and having health professionals saying, well, we can't see anything wrong, therefore you're making it up. It's a very bizarre logic, and it doesn't make sense. It's not logical.
Is it the parental behaviour or motivation, or must the definition include the idea that the child must have suffered harm as a result, significant harm as a result?
That's a really good question, because Munchausen syndrome by proxy effectively evolved into a condition that's now called factitious disorder imposed on another in the psychiatric manuals. And that is a psychiatric condition, and it requires that the parent is intentionally deceiving, knows what they're doing, and that parent's behavior can't be explained by something else. So if they're anxious, or if they have some other condition that explains why they're behaving in that particular way, then it's not FDIOA, it's not factitious disorder, it's something else, and it wouldn't get diagnosed. But FII is not a psychiatric condition. It's not even a diagnosis. It's referred to by the RCPCH as a pediatric diagnosis, but it isn't. It doesn't exist in a diagnostic manual. they use it as if it's a thing, but it isn't a thing. So that's one of the things one of the areas that's quite frustrating. They're very clear in their guidance that parental motivation is, from their perspective, irrelevant, because what matters from the perspective of FII is if the child is harmed. But what then gets tricky is the definition of harm, because the RCPCH will define harm effectively as a child who's taken for lots of medical investigations or taken to the doctor more times than other people think is appropriate, or is taken out of school and other people don't think that they should have been. That's all being interpreted as harm, but there's no evidence that that's harm. So the situation that Ellie was describing, where you have the school saying, well, we don't think there's a problem, and everything's being experienced at home, very quickly gets interpreted as parental harm and abuse of the child, because the school or other professionals are just simply not seeing the behaviours.
I mean, I suppose a child might be presenting in a particular way, and the mum or father might be just overly anxious to try and find out, what is wrong. I mean, in what way does an anxious parent abuse a child?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think you also have to think about what's the definition of overly anxious. At what point is someone being inappropriately anxious? Any parent who's worried about their child wants to know what's wrong with their child and is going to have a level of concern and anxiety about that. But I think what's challenging is when people start to say that parents are overly anxious. What they actually mean is, we don't think that there's a problem, and this mum keeps telling us that there is, and we would really rather hope they go away and just take our word for it, because we don't accept that there's anything wrong, or we haven't found anything that's wrong. And in situations like Ellie described, where you're not even getting referred to the specialist who could actually be the person who answers that question, then that's really tricky. And I think most sensible parents, if they have the courage to do so, actually would be challenging or going and finding alternative professionals, or saying, well, I'm not getting very far, I'm still worried about my child, I'll go and find a specialist. But that's also seen as a flag for possibly making it up, because you've gone to find somebody else, you haven't accepted what that professional has said. So the whole situation is almost geared around, it has a little bit of a feel of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest about it, in that once you've stepped onto that pathway and somebody starts to view you potentially as making stuff up or not accepting the professional opinion, then that doesn't go away, and it skews the way that that's looked at. And you might even be at risk of having less opportunity of being referred to the specialist who needs to see you, because the people that you're interacting with have become so certain in their own minds that there's nothing going on, and that you're just some kind of deluded individual.
But the interpretation, the definition of the condition itself is critically important, isn't it? Because otherwise you're going to have sort of a wide, broad interpretation placed by child protection agencies, which then could invoke court proceedings, for example, unnecessarily and improperly, and without evidence.
Exactly, and unfortunately that's what's happened. And added to that, there are comments in the RCPCH guidelines that specifically say things like examples of the kind of conditions that might be fabricated are autism or neurodevelopmental presentations, which might be a parent who's struggling to manage their child. Or they say, you might have an autistic mother who is overly anxious and uncertain about parenting, and that might therefore also be FII. So they're actually stating conditions as being indicators and associated with FII, without any evidence to support that whatsoever.
I think that's probably a good point to bring in Andy, because Andy, what are the alert signs? I mean, in accordance with the guidance, the alert signs, what advice is given to practitioners to look out for when they are confronting a parent and a child in this kind of situation?
Okay, I mean, I think the first thing is that there are only alerting signs, that there's no actual process for diagnosis. This is not a very well evidenced or evidenced at all. entity. In fact, when we started looking at this, what you would expect with a disease or so on, it would be that there would be an evidence base on which it was based. So you would expect epidemiological evidence, you know, how often is this occurring? Where is it recurring? There's only some very limited evidence. It's very flawed, and it was done years and years ago on a very flawed basis. There's nothing on the accuracy and precision of diagnostic tests. Nobody's done research on it. So they brought out a completely new set of what they call alerting signs. And remember, this is effectively what we're talking about here is profiling. We're not talking about diagnosis, we're talking about profiling. So we're looking at diagnosis by profiling somebody. They fit into these categories. Now, the categories are very broad, but they revolve around basically a problem between diagnosis and a belief about what should happen because of a diagnosis or lack of diagnosis, and what's being seen. So you get the first one: reported physical, psychological, or behavioural symptoms and signs not observed independently in their reported context. Now that sounds like, yes, it'd be very easy to think about that, but you've just heard about a problem where the presentation was a lot more at home than it was at school. So there's a real issue about that. One of the ways that they've tried to get around this is to bring people into hospital and observe them. But observations, even in hospital conditions, are not perfect. They miss things that are infrequent. They miss things which happen because of context.
They're very artificial, Andy, aren't they?
Artificial, yes. So we've got a real problem with the diagnosis of this, and yet the outcomes of a diagnosis, or the outcomes of, I keep using the word diagnosis, I shouldn't, because it isn't. This isn't an illness. If it's an illness, who's got it? Is it the child? Is it the parent? And if the illness is being anxious, that doesn't seem to me to be something that you diagnose as a medical condition. So we've got real problems with it. And then you start picking up lots of things which are about opinion. So the parent's insistence on continued investigation, you know, instead of focusing on symptom alleviation. Well, that's, you know, if, like we heard from Ellie, there's a misdiagnosis, then they're going to continue. You're going to continue insisting on more investigations because the answers haven't been found. Inappropriately seeking multiple medical opinions. Well, if Ellie hadn't done that, she wouldn't have got the treatment that her child needed. And that's the case for many other parents that I've seen who've been accused of this. It's actually delayed the right sort of treatment being taken. Not able to accept reassurance or recommended management. Again, you know, Ellie's given us such an eloquent description of when that is so wrong. And behind all this is the issue of diagnosis in medicine and the accuracy of diagnoses. There are many, many rare diseases or difficult to diagnose diseases, which maybe apply to only small numbers of people. But when you tot up the numbers of different things that could lead to one of these diagnoses, I think the World Health Organization estimated that I think it was 1 in 8 of all people would at some point be subject of a rare condition. Now, what we've got here is a real problem because you've got conditions that are hard to diagnose, that can be misdiagnosed, and that then are interpreted as a parent lying or exaggerating and harming their child. Now, I know that there's probably a very, very small number of cases where there is serious harm done, and you know there is this whole business of somebody actually changing the results of things, or poisoning their child, or suffocating the child. It's rare. I tried to look up how many children had died of these sorts of things, because again, the research says a high proportion of children where they're looking at FII will die. when I looked through the whole of the database for the last 8 years of serious case reviews, there were only 2 cases of children who died where FII was mentioned, and neither of them had died from FII. One was a suicide, and one was an older teenage girl who had a heart failure. None of these were fitted what used to be called Munchausen, and which had all the problems that Munchausen's had. And now what we've got is a set of criteria that are going to lead to many, many more people being drawn into that net inappropriately and at great harm to them.
And destroying families, as we've seen in any situation. And there could be a whole range of reasons why a parent might be apprehensive and trying to find as many answers as they can about presentations that they're exhibiting.
When your child is ill, unwell, chronically, you are their voice, and it is incumbent on you to help someone figure it out. You go to the doctor for help. To have that turned on you, also that I think I must comment about invisible conditions and hidden illness and chronic illness and our understanding and acceptance around that, because I think this is hugely part of that there is a lack of acceptance that unless you can see the condition, or unless the lab tests come back positive, and let's be clear on lab tests, the lab tests on the narrow criteria that the doctor asks for them to look at. So often there's an awful lot that is overlooked. So I think that the attitudes, the hubris, the approach towards ethical humanitarian care is lost, absolutely lost, and it's a travesty and devastating. So.
Thank you, Ellie. I mean, Andy, does it have to start with the motivation of the parent? I mean, does one have to establish that it somehow it's a desire on the parent's part to fulfill their own sort of unmet emotional needs? Is that
this is one of the myths of what's been presented as FII. That was originally something which came up in Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The problem with the new definition is that it's so broad and it contains so many different things which are actually not the same as each other. You know, being over anxious and asking for extra help is not the same as smothering a child to death. These things are entirely different. And when you start to treat everything as being the same, what you end up with is everything getting the worst case scenario. So we're over anxious about everything. We worry that they're all at the serious end when they aren't even the same thing. And that's I say, the fundamental problem with all this.
It's like the other thing from what we heard from Fiona a moment ago was that there has to be some establishment of abuse or harm. I mean, who decides what is the detriment that the child might have suffered as a result of that? Is there anything in the guidance that helps?
I find that there's not a lot in the guidance that helps, because so much of it is this broad overview and that is falsely indicating what's going on. Obviously, in terms of going before a court, you've got to have some form of significant harm. Somebody has to make a judgment on that. The formal process for that should be that there's that a social worker does an assessment under Section 47 of the 89 Act. So there has to be that sort of assessment. Now, the real problem with this is about medical power. The issue here is that at the start of all this, you've got the problem of medical power between the parents and the medics who are saying, this isn't how we see it, and you've got to conform to what we say. And then at the element of it, when it comes before the child protection end of the spectrum, you've got social workers having to stand up to medical power themselves, because they will be presented, the way these procedures go, with a situation where a lot has already been done and a conclusion has been reached. And I think it's for social workers to question that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's one thing about whether you meet the threshold of significant harm to warrant sort of formal legal proceedings. But as we've heard in Ellie's case, it doesn't have to go that far before it devastates the family. I mean,
Exactly.
the alerting signs are, from what you were mentioning, it causes me really some grave concerns. I mean, particularly about whether or not this is in many ways discriminating very, very badly against groups of parents who may themselves have a disability. And I'd like to bring in Judy to discuss that. I mean, Judy, is that a concern that you have in relation to these alert signs and the discrimination that might often follow as a result?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big issue. I mean, I've been involved now for 20 years in assessment and diagnosis of autism in particular. And I totally agree with what Fiona's saying about, yes, paediatricians and GPs are very, very skilled, and they are, skilled medical professionals. However, they don't necessarily have the specialist knowledge in every single condition. And a lot of the perplexing presentation side of it is around the fact that it's not perceived as being a neurodevelopmental difficulty. It's not seen as autism. And things like PDA, the pathological demand avoidant kind of presentation, where children can present in very dysregulated and upset kind of ways, it's interpreted in a way, in a framework that they understand, and not necessarily in the way that those people who see it every day and work with it every day might interpret it. And when you're saying about parents, yeah, I mean, obviously there are parents out there who have neurodevelopmental difficulties themselves and who may be autistic. And a lot of the time they have been misdiagnosed as having personality disorders. And as Andy points out, one of the red flag things is about this perception about personality disorders and people doing things for their own kind of emotional and psychological needs. And, these parents with autism do not have personality disorders, they have autism. And so many of them will report the horrendous experiences, the anxiety that they experience about their interactions with professionals and how those interactions might be interpreted. And it can be very difficult, because the more anxious they become, the more challenging they can be perceived to be by other professionals, because they may be stuck on a particular point. They may really need to get their point across. And, there is no evidence out there to suggest that parents with autism are any worse at parenting their children than any other parent. Again, it's a misconception. And, the guidance talks about these parents, and it's in a very kind of derogatory, judgmental kind of way, with, like Andy's saying, no real evidence to support that these parents, as they are called, are any different to other parents.
And yet it's terrifying from that 2016 study, which I mentioned when I introduced Fiona.
Yeah.
The number of parents who have faced accusations and have been investigated by social services when they are autistic themselves. It's just terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And when you talk about harm to the child, it talks about the child needing to have education and a social life and all those kind of things that you would expect that they actually should want. But, maybe sometimes the education that they're being offered is not right for them. And when you're talking in terms of harm, actually the harm of putting the child into that situation where they are traumatized on a daily basis, the harm that can result from that is actually a lot worse than the fact that the parent has taken them out of school or has taken them for medical appointments. Because I've worked in inpatient services and I've seen the results of these young people having complete breakdowns and ending up in a far worse situation than they would have been had their parents been believed and had they been offered the appropriate education and support packages.
I mean, I suppose people with autism will have a particular interest in getting to the bottom, and they almost, for some people, it might be almost an obsession to get to the bottom of what is causing the child to be so unwell in these given situations, and yet that obsession, based on the interpretation and the information we've been given by everyone today, is more likely than not to lead to this kind of allegation.
Yeah, actually one person's obsession is another person's special interest, and actually a lot of these parents can be exceptionally good at their research. They're very thorough and they have really done their homework. So again, we're even using the word obsession has a slightly negative connotation to it, and there are judgments around that. You know, they're often very, very good and they know what they know. Absolutely,
yeah. And I suppose from the definition, I was looking at the guidance earlier, and you know, there's mention made of, you know, exaggeration of conditions, I suppose, and then and people can be accused of over-exaggerating the symptom. I mean, in what way does exaggeration actually equate to fabrication?
Well, again, it's not exaggeration. I think some of that comes about because these behaviours are simply not seen in school. And just because a child isn't necessarily throwing the chairs around the room, you know, as Ellie said, sometimes they simply just merge into the background, and it builds up all day. And then they go home, and the parents, when they're in their safe place, the child will explode and will display quite challenging and difficult behaviour. So the parent is not exaggerating what they're seeing. They're reporting their reality. And actually, when you talk on a daily basis to parents, they're often broken and they are desperate for somebody to listen to them and offer them some kind of support. So, you know, they're not exaggerating, they're reporting their reality.
I think we have to be really brave that for some children, the educational environments as they are extremely difficult and they aren't able to get out of that cycle. We also need to accept that we want parents to seek help when they need it. We actually rely on them to do so. And what we are doing with all of this guidance, and these attitudes and perceptions, is we are shoving parents under buses on a daily basis. We're traumatizing both the parents and the children, and we are driving parents' fears underground because they're going to be too afraid to seek support.
Yeah. And believe me, when you have a genuine parent sitting in your clinic room, and you can see the pain, you know, why would anyone want to make that up? Why would anyone want to exaggerate that? These parents are broken.
Well, I mean, Judy, I'm just
being devil's exaggeration point.
Sorry, carry on. Sorry, Andy.
I think the exaggeration point is also interesting because, you know, as a man, there's man flu, and who doesn't exaggerate? Who doesn't at times, if they want to get something, say, put a particular point of view over it, which is what exaggeration maybe is a way of trying to say, look, I'm really concerned about this. And there is research on this which shows that exaggeration and even misrepresentation of previous illnesses is common in most patients. So the danger is that this continues to find things which are common and labels them as not common and due to some sort of problem with the parents.
Thank you, Andy. Kathy, I think I would like to ask you about whether, is it a case in your experience that these are the kind of allegations that are made against mothers more than they are fathers?
I think I've heard of one father being accused of FII, and everyone else that I've been contacted with has been a mother. Yeah, or female.
And in what way do we have any statistics on that? Is there anything published that you're aware of that?
I'm not aware of statistics, but I am, and I think all the team that I work with here would say that it is primarily females, women, that are accused of FII. So I don't think, in some ways there's a lot coming up about FII, but in other ways there's not a lot of research that's gone into it. It's a lot of speculation, and it's a lot of putting together different behaviours to arrive at something which isn't a diagnosis. and it's becomes much more specific to women. And I think also that when parenting's called into question, it's the woman who's blamed when parenting doesn't work as well as it should. Very rarely the father.
In what way would you say that, or do you agree that social work practice needs to fundamentally change?
I think I think the key has to be social workers are. The approach needs to be very much about having an inquiring mind and not taking at face value what's said. So if it's a school, I'm contacting the local authority children's services saying we think this mother has FII, this is what's happened, or the child's fine in school, they're not fine at home. I think it has to be about the social worker taking that on board, because we as professionals we have to act, but thinking what is the bigger picture here. And it's also about a social worker undertaking a very comprehensive, thorough assessment if it gets to that point. And I think there has to be questions raised. For example, one of the issues that comes up, and I think that my colleagues here would say the same thing, is sometimes a parent has made a complaint against a medical practitioner, against a paediatrician or their GP. And then that triggers a referral for FII because of that. But when actually what's been proven is that their complaint has been legitimate. And it's when they are being disregarded or ignored or fobbed off. And another issue is when parents have challenged a school because the school are possibly saying child's fine in school, it's a problem for home, which comes up over and over again. And the school is thinking, well, this mother, it doesn't let go, and they are sort of making a referral through against children's services. And so I think those sorts of things need to be looked at, questioned, as almost part of a checklist for social workers before they action child protection proceedings.
What about parents whose children can't face school because the demands are too overwhelming, and yet they face prosecution for not sending their children to school? That must be an area that comes up in social work practice that you're seeing frequently, surely.
Yes, I have seen, and I actually remember working with an autistic father at one point. I was doing some work with him, and this happened, and he took it very, very seriously about the local authority saying we're going to prosecute because your child's not in school, and then getting so angry that they sort of got more and more angry and frustrated at home, which led to child protection procedures happening because of that. They didn't actually harm the child, but there were significant concerns because their frustration was it became so pent up, and they exploded at home because of that. It does happen, yeah.
And also, I suppose, that is there not another problem caused by incorrect diagnoses of the parent themselves? I mean, the personality disorders being confused with autism, for example.
I think Judy's already talked about this, and I think it is, and we know this, that a lot of parents who are particularly women again, who are diagnosed as having emotionally unstable personality disorder or other related issues are actually autistic. And even when some parents have had an autism diagnosis, there's still professionals and particularly social workers saying, well, we think this mum's got a personality disorder, it's not autism. And my question is, who is a social worker to make that kind of assumption diagnosis? Because we are not, we're not into the diagnostic. That's not part of our job. Our job's to be inquiring, but it is not to say, well, I don't agree with that diagnosis, it's wrong.
Well, I'd like to ask my guests to, in their own, in summary form, explain, in their view, what is it that you believe needs to change? What is the shift that you would think needs to happen in practice to separate the genuine cases whereby a child is in fact being harmed from the cases whereby children are in fact exhibiting unusual presentations that require more genuine investigation. I mean, what's your take on that? I'll ask each of you. I mean, Fiona, what do you think is the primary thing that needs to change?
For me, it's actually having FII be evidence-based, because it isn't. If you read the new guidance, the RCPCH admits there is no up-to-date evidence, but they're actually only talking about prevalence rates. What they fail to recognise is that what they're calling FII itself and perplexing presentations itself, neither of those have any evidence basis behind them at all. They've been created. There's no medical test for them. There's no diagnostic test for them. They are not diagnoses, but throughout their own guidance, they refer to them as diagnoses. So effectively, these conditions, these situations, whatever they are, these definitions have been created without an evidence basis and without being tested. And for me, because I work academically as well as clinically, one of the biggest risks that you have in these sorts of situations is when you have risk criteria which have no measured sensitivities and specificities to those criteria. So if we were developing an instrument clinically, and I wanted to actually see how well that identified the cases I was interested in. So let's say I was inventing an instrument for autism, and I wanted to see how good it was at picking up genuine cases of autism. You would do an awful lot of research, and then you would look at its sensitivity to picking up only genuine cases and not including false positives, and its specificity to those genuine cases. And you try to get it as close to 100% in both of those, so that you know that the only cases you're getting are actual cases of autism and not accidentally including other people. There is no sensitivity and specificity data for this. What then makes that worse is if you then apply that when it's supposedly a very rare condition. So you're looking for alerting signs that have been made up for a condition that's acknowledged to be very rare, and then you apply it, for example, to a population where you know there are a lot of them. So we have over 1% of the general population are autistic. So 1 in 100 people is on the autistic spectrum. And I did a little bit of statistics around that, and effectively, if your alerting signs were, even if they were 90% accurate, you're still going to get 10% of the autistic people that you're looking at being false positives, being falsely accused. And when you then project that up to the numbers of people with autism that you've got in the country, that's hundreds of thousands of people, tens of thousands of families being accused of something inappropriately to find what might be 350 genuine cases of actual induction of illness. So that's where the problem is. There is no evidence basis. So for me, that was a very long way of saying, find some evidence. Don't give us guidance for something with absolutely no scientific evidence behind it.
Thank you, Fiona. Judy, we have to balance this against, the idea that children, of course, must at all times be safe. I mean, the law under the Children Act is to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. That's an obligation on local authorities. In what way do you think that local authorities' practice needs to change to differentiate between, how do they better differentiate between the genuine from the genuine cases of concern from those which really are misconceived?
Yeah, well, I suppose from my point of view as a working diagnostician, I would say to, please listen to specialist teams. That there are a number of specialist teams throughout the country who are looking specifically at autism and different and alternative presentations to the stereotypical one. Please listen to them. Please involve them in your conversations and your thinking, because the only way that this will be overcome is by better understanding and better joint working, across the board with families and professionals who specialise in a particular area. I mean, it's like Ellie was saying, you know, if they'd found their specialist earlier, there wouldn't have been that delay. And it's exactly the same with autism and these perplexing presentations. People are left for years and years and years in limbo, and it shouldn't happen. So that would be my
thank you, Judy. Andy, any thoughts on your side? I mean, we're running out of time shortly, but any quick thoughts you have?
I think the real problem is with the balance of risk. We're doing a lot to find some very rare cases where children are being harmed. And there's even a real problem about the lack of evidence for how many of them there are and how many are seriously harmed. And at the same time, if what we do is we draw many people into a system that itself harms them, being investigated is a massive stress on families. I work a lot of the time with parents who've been through the system, and years after they've been accused of having harmed their child, they can't sleep, they have nightmares. This is an important issue. We have to make sure that we don't overestimate the risk to children. And at the moment, we're way, way onto the overemphasis side, and we need to stop that.
Thank you, Andy. Kathy?
Yeah, I think sort of leading on really what Andy's saying, I think we absolutely, as social workers, I'm a social worker, we need to listen to parents. We need to listen to what they're saying. Very often they are the expert of their child. And so, they're not necessarily making up concerns. And I think it comes down to doing a very, very good, robust assessment, bringing together different professionals' opinions, which might not all agree, and it's also about a social worker, for example, doing things like when we're not in lockdown, observing a child in school, seeing them at home, looking at the differences, looking at what those differences might be about, whether they are masking in school and coming home and letting everything go. Those sorts of things must be considered rather than just taking a professional or medical professional opinion that usually the mother is fabricating or inducing a child's illness. I think that's really important. And I think the other thing is having that rounded opinion about, have there been complaints again, within other complaints within this? Does the parent have a diagnosis? Is there sort of some genetic condition that might run through the family? All those sorts of things need to be considered, and before arriving at FII.
And the social worker may even have to. The social worker may even have to have a look at whether there has been adequate medical investigations that, as part of their search to see this, and to make sure that a real illness hasn't just been written off by a generalist without a referral to a specialist.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Ellie, I mean, very quickly, in what way, if you were summing up, what do you think from a parent's perspective needs to change?
Trust in the parent, being alert to shame-blame cycles. So as a professional, if I'm being pulled to shaming or blaming the parent, why is that? What is it in me that I am feeling pulled to do that? Is it maybe, the end result isn't parents are making it up, but is it, I can't refer here, I'm not the right person, I don't have the tools, there isn't the budget, I don't have the time, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I've had a bad day. Whatever that is, being alert to that and drawing on the support of your team and collaborative opinions in order to come to a conclusion, and really checking and double checking before you label a parent as being the problem. But finally, I'm really concerned about, we touched briefly around the gender bias around women. We are pathologizing women still, decades on. Parents, women were locked up for hysteria. This is parental concern being pathologized on an epic scale. and it has to stop. We have to understand that perhaps we speak with a more authentic voice. Perhaps we are better at articulating the requirement of care that is absent. But that isn't on us as a problem. That's on the professionals to resolve. And yes, conditions are perplexing. As a scientist, as a medic, that's on you to work that out. That isn't an excuse to label and pathologize it as being a problem for you. So I think there's massive areas that need to work on, and it comes down to building relationships, working together, trust, collaborating, keep on going until you find the solution, because children don't just present with something for the fun of it. Parents don't ask for help, for attention. Nobody wants to be a family in need. Believe me, it is a horrible place to be. We all just want to sit and fit and work in society and get on like the, keep up with the Joneses. And all too often we are made into burdens and problems because we can't, and we're in need.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you to all my guests. I mean, I must say that what a topic, really. I mean, it's FII, perplexing conditions, presentations, I beg your pardon. I mean, the whole thing to me sounds like it lacks clarity. The definitions are too broad. Too many people can be falsely accused. There's a lack of understanding of many various presentations that need exploring before you reach that conclusion. I mean, I know looking back, I sometimes, as a practitioner, and I've been practicing law now nearly 30 years, and I remember my early days when I used to do a lot of child protection cases. There's one case that just sticks out in my mind as a case that I've never forgotten. It hurts me to this day. And that a case where a parent was accused of this. I never forget, I will never forget as long as I live, the trauma and the squeal, the howling in pain that parent exhibited in the courts when they lost their child. And do you know, it's funny because ever since that case, which was something like 20 odd years ago, I became more specialist in my subject area. We all do, of course, as time passes, we become more and more skilled at what we do. And I can tell you with some confidence, I mean, there's perhaps I can leave with a more optimistic message. In my years, that was the last case ever that I can ever recall where a parent was accused of fabricating an illness which led to their child being lost when I was representing them. I've seen it as an education practitioner being raised more often than you can ever imagine, whereby parents are often accused of fabricating illness and involving social care. I've seen it so often. But the optimistic message that I can send to you is that I have never in all my practice since that one case I mentioned has ever seen social services take us on after when we've got involved in it. Because we generally get to the bottom of these things, and the kind of things that we see that the practitioners, all of us here, have been talking about, we thoroughly look into. And that requires, I think, a four-dimensional knowledge of the special needs, an understanding of the conditions, the discrimination that occurs and that we've talked about today, and an understanding, a complex, detailed understanding of the legal requirements. And I think that the law needs to change too in some ways. I mean, there needs to be, practitioners need to be more and more aware of conditions, of these kind of rare conditions. And I mean, just take autism. In the last presentation, two presentations ago, we talked about the dangers of sole diagnosis of autism and the kind of mistakes that often are made even on the autism diagnosis itself. What a subject. I think we should be concluding really with there is optimism, because I think with professionals like we've seen today, eventually these voices will be heard. Eventually Ellie's voice will be heard, and people will ultimately have to take notice, because the courts will time and time again say that the allegations are misconceived. A good court, good practitioners involved in it, good experts. Get the right experts to help you. Can I thank all my guests? I mean, it's been absolute pleasure having you on today, and you've talked so eloquently and such detailed knowledge of the subject. And I would like to ensure that, you know, if there's any literature that you have that you would want to share with those who are watching this presentation today, please feel free to share that literature, and we will have some information available. I know Ellie wants to give some information to us, and on this post, when it comes out, you'll see some resources that will come on the post too, about what you might want to look for when for help. I mean, in if you're facing that kind of terrible dilemma. And for me, again, thank you all to my guests, and thank you for watching this sixth and last edition of this series of the Education Magazine. We'll have much more to come when the next series opens, but we'll have a little break now while we scratch our heads and think about other things that we want to cover in the fullest of time. And we're still coming out of a lockdown now, and there's going to be a lot of difficulties undoubtedly that children will face as they slowly evolve back into school. We'll see you again very shortly, where we'll be exploring all of those kind of things in the future. So thanks again for watching, and thank you all to my guests too for your and to Ellie, of course, for her very brave presentation about what she went through. So thanks again. I'll see you all very soon.